As I was thinking about what I wanted to bring your way this morning, I got to thinking about our series last time from the book of Hebrews. And in the course of that book, there was a section there where I finished a class talking a little bit about the Abomination of Desolation. And I was pretty amazed when the class was over. I had a lot of folks came up to me and said, "We've never heard of this. We find it extremely interesting. We'd like to know more about it." And so I thought, well, if I'm going to just do one class here, let's just go ahead and do that on this biblical predictive prophecy of the Abomination of Desolation. And in so doing, we're going to be looking at a lot of the history of this process, but at the end, I want to show you some practical things as to what this can teach us in terms of allowing us to be closer to God and doing His will instead of our own. The first mention of the Abomination of Desolation comes from the predictive sections of the book of Daniel. 3 times in the book. "Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering." Now I want you to keep that in your mind there. He's going to bring an end to sacrifice and offering. "And on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate." The second time it shows up. "And forces shall be mustered by him." Now I want you to remember that too. Forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Keep both those things in mind. There's going to be an army, forces, and there's going to be the defilement of the sanctuary. "And they shall take away the daily sacrifices." Again, the idea of the removal of sacrifice. "And place there the abomination of desolation." And then in the last reference in Daniel, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Now there's an awful lot we could try to go through on just those 3 verses, but we don't have time to do that this morning. I'm going to hone in this morning on what Jesus says about the abomination of desolation, and he references Daniel and what he says about it, so that we can understand what it was. Now, initially, I want you to know that a lot of scholars think that there was a partial fulfillment of this abomination of desolation in 167 BC. There was a ruler in Syria by the name of Antiochus IV, and he hated the Jews, couldn't stand them. And so Antiochus, he named himself Epiphanes, Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes means, this shows you what this guy's about. Epiphanes means illustrious one or God manifest. So that's what he called himself, Antiochus Epiphanes. And in 167 BC, he went into the temple and sacrificed a pig on the altar there. Now, you well know from your reading of the Old Testament, pigs were one of the most unclean animals in the Jewish system that there was. And so he went into the temple, sacrificed this pig, and at the same time, he made it known that he was offering this pig to Zeus. So, a lot of folks, and I'm in agreement with this, a lot of folks think there's a partial fulfillment of the abomination of desolation in Daniel in that very thing. Antiochus Epiphanes and his desecration of the temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar. However, 200 years later, around 33 AD, Jesus is again going to call upon the readers to take heed about the abomination of desolation, which means from Jesus' time, it was predictive to him. It was future. And I think what we're going to see this morning, well, I know we will, what we're going to see this morning is what this has to do with is the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple along with it in 70 AD by the Roman armies led by Titus. When we get into what Jesus has to say about it, I want you to really pay attention to how specific he is about the event and how what he says about the event is going to match up perfectly with what happened in 70 AD in Jerusalem. Before we get into any of that, I want you to know a couple of terms. Abomination just means that it is something that is disgusting. It's oftentimes associated with that which is defiling or idolatrous. Now, if you think about the Roman armies, they carried those placards with Caesar as God. And so when they enter the temple in 70 AD, you can see how that matches up. And then desolation just means a condition that is uninhabitable and devastated, which we will see a little later on today, is an apt description of Jerusalem after Titus brought the Roman legions against it in 70 AD. I want to start with something that Jesus said in Luke 19:43. This is the passage where he comes to Jerusalem and weeps over it. And I want you to know specifically what he says. For days will come upon you. He's standing there looking out over Jerusalem and weeping about it. For days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you. I'm going to show you a video here in a little while, and you're going to see that's exactly what the Romans did. For days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you. You're going to see what happens when Rome gets to Jerusalem. They have to go against 3 different walls. When they get to the inner wall and they can't finish the job, what they do is they surround that wall, they put up a siege and starve them. Surround you and close you in on every side and level you. You're going to see from this video, they level Jerusalem. And your children within you to the ground. And they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation. Now, that is really important, and we're going to talk about that at the end of the lesson. You did not know the time of your visitation. He says this judgment that's coming upon Jerusalem is specifically due to the fact that when God came into the world, you didn't know Him and you rejected Him. And so there's going to be a great judgment against Judaism and the Mosaical system and all of that. We looked at that back in Hebrews. But it all was contingent upon the fact that they did not recognize God when He came to them. And we're going to make a practical point about that a little bit later on. So, 200 years now, after Antiochus Epiphanes had gone in and done his desecration of the temple with the sacrifice of that pig, in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus and his disciples are leaving the temple, and Jesus is going to say something to them that's going to floor them. You can just see in what they ask their astonishment at what he says to them. This is it. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things?" Now watch this. "Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Now what you need to recognize here is they asked 3 different questions, although I think in their mind they couldn't imagine that temple being totally destroyed like that except with the coming of Christ. And so they ask 3 different questions here. And so what we need to understand is that from this point forward in Matthew 24 until you get all the way down to verse 34, everything that Jesus is talking about there is describing this abomination of desolation. It can get really confusing to folks because there is are images in that passage whereby it looks like it's talking about the second coming of Christ. It really looks that way. But I would suggest to you that those passages are in place to speak to the judgment that is going to come upon Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so what Jesus is going to do in Matthew 24, all the way down to verse 34, is he's going to answer their first question. When are these things going to happen? When is the temple going to be destroyed? And I know for a fact that all of Matthew up to that point, of Matthew 24, is talking about this, because in Matthew 24:34, Jesus says this, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." He's talking about all the things that he had talked to them about, Matthew 24, all the way up to verse 34. He says, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Well, in the midst of that discourse, he said this to them. "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel, the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those with nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be on winter or on the Sabbath. For then there shall be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened." So he's telling them, when you see these signs, get out, leave. Don't stick around. And if you're outside, don't go back, just leave. And I'll tell you an interesting thing that I just read this week. The church that met in Jerusalem at that time got out. They listened to what Jesus had to say here and got out when they saw the signs. They went away, and they were not harmed by what happened in Jerusalem in 70 AD. There's a lesson there, I think, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we're going to see how spot on this warning of Jesus is to what happened in Jerusalem in 70 AD. When you come to Luke's account of this, Luke only speaks to the first question that they asked, which Matthew shows they actually asked three, but Luke really hones in on the first question. "Then as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations, he said, These things which you see, the days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." So they asked him, saying, "Teacher, but when will these things be? And what sign will there be when these things are about to take place?" And it's here that he begins to describe, again, similar to what he said in Matthew, but he adds a couple of things that I want you to see, which will match up beautifully once you see what really happened in Jerusalem at that time. In Luke chapter 21, verses 20 to 24, again, he's giving them signs. When will these things be? When will the temple be destroyed? When will not one stone be left on another? "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. For there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the time of Gentiles are fulfilled." I really like this quote by a man named Dan Doriani, and this is how I understand this too, and he makes a really good point here. He says, this prophecy makes sense only with reference to the fall of Jerusalem. It cannot possibly apply to Jesus' return. When he comes, it will be pointless for an unbeliever to try to flee. And a believer will not want to flee. For the same reason, the following command not to go back to get a cloak and the woe for nursing mothers who must flee cannot refer to Jesus' return, but they make perfect sense when Jesus predicts that another abomination of desolation like Antiochus Epiphanes of Daniel is coming. Indeed, that abomination did come in Roman form in AD 70. The Roman armies were always an abomination because they carried with them idolatrous images of the emperor whom they worshipped. And those armies brought desolation because their commander leveled the city and entered the Holy of Holies, defiling it. Okay. I want to show you, this is about a 15-minute video, but I want to show it to you because it really does a great job of describing what happened in AD 70 in Jerusalem. And what I want you to understand too is this was a months-long siege that went on there. You might get the idea that Romans showed up, a couple of days, the thing's over. That's not how it happened. It was many months. But this video is going to do a great job of showing you, and I'd rather you see it than me try to describe it, showing you what happened in AD 70. And I want you to think about what Jesus said and all those predictions that he was making to the folks about the army surrounding them and the destruction and all that, and see how it matches up beautifully with this battle in AD 70.
In the spring of the year 70 CE, Titus marches his legions from the coastal plain to Jerusalem. He's boiling with anger. It has been 4 years and the Roman army has not succeeded in suppressing the stubborn revolt that broke out in Judea. The Jews fight courageously for every piece of land. Even the esteemed commander Vespasian, Titus' father, could not defeat them. Now, after his father's appointment to emperor, it's Titus' turn to manage the campaign. He commands the most powerful war machine in the world, tens of thousands of trained legionnaires equipped with advanced weapons, sophisticated breaching tools, and lethal artillery. Against the mighty Roman army stands a small force of fighters who will fight for their freedom until their last drop of blood. The final battle of the Great Revolt against Rome begins. It will be a battle that will never be forgotten. In the dark of night, Titus brings up his soldiers from 3 directions to Jerusalem. As dawn breaks on the 14th of Nisan, the eve of Passover, the residents of Jerusalem awaken to a sight that makes their blood run cold. 60,000 Roman soldiers, thirsty for war, surrounded the city from every direction. Only now, when the Romans stand at the gates of the city, does the tragedy caused by the civil war raging in the city become clear. In clashes between the various factions, whole sections of Jerusalem were destroyed. Stores of food that could have provided vital provisions during the fighting and siege went up in flames and vanished. Too late, the rebels joined forces against the true enemy. What they lack in weaponry and soldiers will be reinforced by acts of bravery and unrestrained daring. The Jews take the initiative and respond quickly. They attack ferociously before the Romans take up positions. The surprised Romans scatter in all directions. Titus himself escapes by the skin of his teeth. Before the Romans manage to recover, the Jews retreat behind the mighty defenses of the walls of Jerusalem. These walls are Titus' main problem. Jerusalem is built on a hill and surrounded by 3 fortified walls, each stronger than the other. To breach such a wall, Titus must raise huge earthen ramps and bring up siege towers and battering rams to breach it. In excavations conducted in Jerusalem, in the Russian compound, remains of the third wall have been found. It is the outer wall of the ancient city. We have here testimony to the battle. We found more than 70 catapult stones right here at the front of the wall, so that we know a battle took place here. The number and density of the catapult stones and their locations are basically the testimony that there was a battle here during the Roman period, dated according to the potsherds. The evidence enabled us to conclude that we are dealing with a section of the third wall through which the Romans penetrated Jerusalem. With these huge catapult stones, Titus soldiers bombarded the Jewish defenders, thus ensuring that they would not disturb the builds of the ramping. Each of these stones weighs about 26 kilograms and flew at a speed of tens of kilometers per hour. When a stone like this crashed into the wall, it was better not to be there. Under heavy artillery cover, the iron rams climbed to the top of the wall and pierced it. The noise is deafening. The largest battering ram of all, nicknamed Nikon, the victor, was the first to breach the wall. The Roman soldiers burst into Beit Zeta neighborhood. They slaughter the residents without mercy and set the entire neighborhood on fire. Within a few days, the second wall also falls. The Jewish defenses begin to disintegrate. Titus renews the attack and advances his soldiers to the internal wall, the strongest wall of Jerusalem, known as the First Wall. He concentrates most of his efforts here at the Antonia Fortress. The Antonia is the largest, strongest fortress in Jerusalem. It was built by Herod to the north of the Temple Mount in order to control the temple. Titus' plan was well thought out. The moment the Antonia falls, the temple will fall. And when the temple falls, the Jews will lose all hope and Jerusalem will finally fall into his hands. But nothing prepared him for what happens next. In a daring action, the soldiers of John of Giscala succeed in digging a tunnel under the earthen ramp opposite the Antonia, setting fire to its foundations and toppling it together with the soldiers to the ground. At the same time, Simon Bar Giora attacks the ramp opposite the first wall and sets it on fire. Hundreds of Roman soldiers are killed and wounded. All at once, the Roman attack is halted and the entire Roman army is driven out of the city. Stunned by the failure, Titus gathers his commanders urgently and decides to change tactics. If it is not possible to break into the city, he will surround it from without and starve the Jews to death. In a record time of only 3 days, Titus builds a giant siege wall around Jerusalem, a choke ring 7 kilometers long that effectively blocks off all supply lines. Now, starvation sets in to cruelly afflict the city. Affluent people scour the gutters to find scraps of food, and small children whose parents have starved to death wander the streets in search of a piece of bread. The tension in the city grows. Those who are left with a little food eat in secret. Others try to evade the zealots and escape from the city. Most of those who try to flee are caught by the Romans and crucified on wooden beams around the city walls. Fatigue and starvation weaken the Jewish fighters. This is Titus' chance to deal the crushing blow to Jerusalem. The Roman army is concentrated on one task: to conquer Antonia Fortress and break through to the temple. The Jews tried to prevent the capture of the Temple Mount and sabotage the building of the ramps. They shot flaming arrows, Threw giant stones, then poured boiling oil on the head of the Roman soldiers. In the Temple Mount sifting project, iron arrowheads were found. These arrowheads were used for catapult fire. Catapults are machines for shooting arrows, and they bombarded the walls with such force that even the bravest of the Jewish fighters could not withstand. After fierce battles, Titus soldiers gained control of the Antonia. On the 17th of Tammuz, Titus commands them to destroy the mighty citadel down to its foundations. This day, on which according to tradition the city was breached, is commemorated as a day of mourning on the Jewish calendar. The temple service ceased completely, and during the following 3 weeks, the days between the straits, the Jews would struggle in bloody face-to-face battles in the courtyards of God's temple. The battering rams breached the western walls of the Temple Mount. Ladders are leaned against the remains of the wall, and the Roman soldiers stream in mass into the temple courtyard. It seems that the campaign is drawing to a close, but what happens next is totally inconceivable. When the Jews realize that the temple is in real danger, they shake off all feelings of hunger and weakness. Thousands of citizens, women, men, elders, and youth, everyone who can hold a weapon, join the fighters. Together as one man, they fall upon the Romans and block the way to the temple with their bodies. Only one weapon can beat the fire of faith that burns in the hearts of the Jewish fighters, the burning fire of torches. And thus, on the night of the 9th of Av, Titus sets fire to the gates that surround the Temple Mount. On their way to the temple, the Romans burst through, killing, stabbing, and trampling everyone in their path. The blood flows on the colorful stone floors of the Temple Mount as bodies of the slain pile high. The flames quickly spread and approach the entrance to the temple. A moment before it goes up in flames, Titus gathers his commanders for a final consultation to determine the fate of the temple. Josephus claims that Titus opposed destroying the temple, which in his eyes was the glory of human creation. According to Josephus, the fire was caused by accident by a Roman soldier who inadvertently tossed a burning torch into the sanctuary. But most scholars do not believe this is really true. The anger over the many casualties caused by the Jews and the understanding that as long as the temple stood, the Jews would continue to fight, decided the temple's fate. Let them see and fear. On the 9th of Av, towards evening, Titus gave the order, and the following day, the 10th of Av, his soldiers set fire to the sanctuary. The temple that had been the source of inspiration, faith, ethics, and righteousness for the Jewish people and all humanity for centuries, now went up in flames. The cries of pain of the Jews rose up to the heavens. Titus commands the burning of the lower city. In the upper city, the rebels continue to fight stubbornly for another month, until the Romans take control of it too and set it ablaze. The charred remains of fire and destruction discovered by Professor Nachman Avigaad in what was once an opulent neighborhood tell the story of the complete destruction of Jerusalem. Chilling testimony to the last moments of the city is found here, between layers of ruins and ashes. The severed arm of a young woman with a spear alongside it. It appears that she too was unable to escape to the rebels' final refuge, the underground drainage channel. We're inside the drainage channel, where the rebels hid 2,000 years ago. The last of the Jerusalem residents hid in this tunnel, here, where we stand. Suffocating darkness and terrible fear surrounded them. The Romans searched for them, found them, broke through the ceiling of the tunnel, and killed everyone. Among the finds discovered here that testify to the horror was this Roman sword, the Roman gladius, found on the tunnel floor. Nearby were cooking pots, clay lamps, and coins of the revolt, with the Hebrew words, Herut Zion, freedom for Zion, 2 words that expressed the heartfelt aspiration of the Jews who hid and were killed here in the drainage channel in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. It is possible that the death of these people in the depths of the ground was preferable to the horrors suffered by their brethren who were taken captive. The prisoners were sold into lifelong slavery or died in blood sport fighting against wild animals and gladiators. In pain, shock, and sorrow, the Jewish prisoners are marched through the streets of Rome. And before them go the spoils of war from Jerusalem, the golden menorah, and the holy vessels of the temple. Rome celebrates its victory with a parade, with huge monuments and a special coin that glorifies and commemorates the suppression of Judea. Jerusalem, weeping and mourning, descends under layers of ash and destruction. After 5 years of persistent struggle against the strongest empire in the world, the Second Temple is destroyed.
I think you can see how incredibly what Jesus said came to pass. And I also read this week, which just kind of floored me. You remember when they were coming out of the temple and Jesus said, "Time's coming, there will not be one stone left upon another." When Rome burned that temple, there was gold all over that thing. Well, what happened was the gold seeped between the stones, so the Romans literally broke the stones apart to get the gold. I think it's impossible, even watching that, to really understand how horrible this whole event was, but this book I have at home, Caesar's Legion, by Stephen Collins, this gives you a little bit of an idea. To speed defections, Roman troops even roasted goats under the walls. As the aroma of cooking meat was carried into the city on the breeze, some starving refugees inside apparently went crazy. One demented Jewish woman was said to have even cooked and eaten her own baby. Armed bands roved the city searching for hidden reserves of food, killing anyone who resisted. Families fought each other over scraps. Parents supposedly took food from the mouths of their children. When the widow of former high priest Jonathan couldn't buy food despite her wealth, she threw her gold into the street in disgust. And people died from hunger even as they were attending the funerals of friends and relatives. And then he goes on here to talk about what happened afterward. They mentioned it a little bit there. The glittering standards of the legions appeared on the top of the tower. A mighty cheer rang around the valley as the Roman troops realized that the siege was over. Jerusalem was theirs. Much of what was left of the city was burned, and 97,000 prisoners were accounted for. Those identified as resistance leaders were executed. The 700 most handsome prisoners would adorn Titus's and Vespasian's joint triumphal procession in Rome the following year. Other able-bodied young men were sent to the mines of Egypt. The children were sold into slavery. Adults were dispatched to many provinces of the empire to fight wild animals in the arena. And 1 million people were said to have died in Jerusalem from wounds inflicted by the Romans or at the hands of their own people or from starvation. Roman losses in the siege were never put on paper, but the dead and wounded would have run into the thousands. And then you saw a couple of names earlier on in that video about those who were kind of leading the charge. He talks just briefly about what happened to a couple of them. Days later, John of Gischala was discovered in the underground hiding place beneath the city. Titus spared him, sentencing him to life imprisonment. Simon ben Gioras was captured by soldiers of the 10th some days later and sent in chains to Titus, who had returned to Caesarea by that stage. Titus paraded both John and Simon at Rome in the triumph of AD 71, at the end of which Simon was customarily lashed, then strangled. The commander of the third Jewish faction, Eleazar, had died while defending the temple. No wonder Jesus had said in Matthew 24, "For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been seen since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be." Okay, well, what can we learn from all this? Well, I think there's a couple of things that are very obvious. The first would be simply this: the ultimate tragedy in this life is to miss Jesus. I mentioned earlier when Jesus wept over Jerusalem, he said, "This judgment's coming because you didn't know the time of your visitation." And as horrible as this judgment is, or was, the judgments that's coming for those who reject the Christ, this just doesn't even measure on a scale. Paul had talked about this. Well, first of all, let me show you this. This is the Arch of Titus in Rome. It's there to this day. It's in the Roman Forum, which is near the Colosseum. The ruins there. You can walk up and see this. But this was to commemorate the victories that Titus had in this war. And then interestingly, on the arch itself is this. It shows the return of the spoils to Rome from Jerusalem. And look right there to the left a little bit up high, there's the menorah. Which, if you remember from our study in Hebrews, the menorah was in the holy place, along with the bread and the altar of incense. And so this just shows the return of the spoils from Rome. But I found that interesting that they carved in the menorah there, which ties it up beautifully with what they would have found in that temple. But again, what we're saying is the ultimate tragedy in this life is to not know Jesus' visitation, to not know that Jesus has come into this world and that Jesus offers the one thing that we all need more than anything in the world, and that's salvation. And that's salvation from the wrath of God that is to come against all unrighteousness. And so Paul had written, "And to give you who are troubled rest with us when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven with his mighty angels, in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those who do not know God and on those who do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ." So to not know the time of Jesus' visitation, to not know the sacrifice that he has made on the cross, or even, maybe even worse, to know it and not care anything about it, is a horrible tragedy. The second practical thing I would recommend that we can learn from this is, as we look at what Jesus said in those passages, and that occurred 37 years before this event, 37 years before this event, and you see how specific it was, what Jesus said about all of this. Point is, it behooves us to listen to him. On the Mount of Transfiguration, you remember Peter started talking, and then all of a sudden, he has to shut up. Because while he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and suddenly a voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him. That has not stopped being the case. Hear him. I thought about that, so I just wrote down a few things here, and we'll close with this. In practical terms, we need to listen to Jesus. Not need to, we must. First of all, he has the words of life. He has the words of life. In John 6, Jesus taught some difficult things, and it says there that many of the disciples who had been following him walked away from him. Jesus gathered his apostles together and asked a pertinent question: will you also go away? And Peter, who many times doesn't do the right thing, doesn't say the right thing, he said the right thing this time. His answer to that was, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. And those words are seen here. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And then John also quotes Jesus this way. Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. I made the point during the Hebrew lesson, but I'll make it again. There's a lot of people out there saying you can get to God any old way you want to. That simply isn't true. Jesus declared, I'm it. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Don't you think we ought to hear him? This same Jesus has declared the reality of judgment and the reality of hell. If your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life lame or maimed rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into the everlasting fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life with 1 eye rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into hellfire. And then in Luke 12 he said this, but I will show you to whom you should fear. Fear him who after he is killed has power to cast into hell. Yes, I say to you, fear him. This decision that we make regarding Jesus is serious business. It doesn't get any more serious than this. And the same Jesus that predicted this event that we've talked about this morning says this. Are we listening? Are we hearing him? And then lastly, he's determined or has declared the terms of discipleship. When he had called the people to himself with his disciples also, he said to them, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Those are Jesus' terms for following him. How significant is it to look at our own lives, to examine ourselves, and to see those areas in which maybe self still reigns? Because he says, if you're going to follow me, you've got to deny yourself. You've got to take up your cross. I take that to be, you've got to sacrifice yourself in terms of this denial process and follow me. And I think Paul spoke to this in a beautiful way in the book of Philippians, and we'll close with this. It's Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. This is, in my estimation, a commentary of what Jesus said there. Therefore, if there is any consolation in Christ, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and mercy, fulfill my joy by being like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interest of others. And let this mind be in you, which also was in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a servant and coming in the likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Therefore God also has highly exalted him and given him the name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow. We better be bowing right now, of those in heaven and of those on earth and of those under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. A day is coming when everybody's going to admit that he is Lord of Lords. We have the opportunity right now to make our lives right with Christ if we're outside of him, but also to live Christ-led, Christ-exampled lives in terms of seeking the interest of others ahead of our own, denying ourselves, as Jesus said his disciples must do.